you, and welcome to everyone, and thank you especially to the JM Capital Fund for hosting us here tonight. I know they've been gracious and hosted us in the past as well. For the record, and for probably the few of you in the room who don't know me, since I believe I recognize everyone here, my name is Emily Kahn. I'm Executive Director of the New York Preservation Archive Project. I am also a former student and advisee of Andrew Dolkart, whom I am proud to call my mentor, and also one of my favorite people in preservation and beyond. We actually have conducted an oral history with Andrew in the past as part of our Roots of LGBTQ Activism series. It's 2 hours long and it's very interactive and engaging. It's really one of my favorite oral histories in the series as well. But we noticed that focused a lot on this LGBTQ activism work, and we wanted to make sure we had a more general picture of Andrew Dolkart's great accomplishments in New York City preservation over many years. So we're very excited to have Andrew here tonight for this oral history. Andrew, would you like to start by introducing yourself, who you are, and a bit of your background of how you became involved in New York's preservation?
So I'm Andrew Dolkart, and when people ask me what I do, I tell them I'm an architectural historian and preservationist. And my background is that I grew up in Brooklyn, in a progressive household in Brooklyn, and I always wanted to do something that had an impact on people. And I think that in addition to all the things that Lisa said that I'm interested in, it's not only the buildings in the city, but it's the people there. I always say that buildings have lives. And I was one of those people that graduated from college. We both actually went to Colgate University. And I graduated from college, I had no idea what I wanted to do with myself. But I had gotten interested in architecture. And I was trying to figure out what to do, and I thought, well, I'll go and get a PhD in art history. And that I lasted a year. And I had this really interesting experience where I was sitting around with 3 colleagues at lunch, and we were talking about the difference between the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime, which is actually a topic that I find very interesting. But it occurred to me at some point during this that the only people that cared about this were the 4 of us who were sitting there and 25 other people. And that was, I needed to do something else. And then somebody told me about the preservation program at Columbia, and I came down and I met with Jim Fitch, and I never looked back. And I was able to develop a career that combined my love of architectural history with preservation. So I went to Columbia, finished at Columbia, worked at the Landmarks Commission by a fluke. I got a job at the Landmarks Commission the summer before I came to Columbia, by a coincidence. And then I worked for Landmarks, and then I did had my own consulting business, and I was an adjunct teacher at Columbia, and then a job opened and I became a full-time professor, and here I am.
So it's well known that you're a native New Yorker, you're from Brooklyn, but you discussed in your previous oral history with the Archive Project that you traveled extensively as a child. Did you always know you wanted to stay in New York City?
I did. I really wanted to. I loved traveling, and we would go cross country every summer, and it was always exciting to see places. You know, I was at 11 years old, I was the one that wanted to stop at house museums. I knew there was something there. I grew up in a household where going away to college was what you were going to do. And so I wanted to do that. I wanted to go away, but I wanted to come back. I really fell in love. Growing up, I fell in love with New York. I was of a generation where there was no such thing as a play date. You just went out. And since I grew up in the city, and after a certain age, I was able to take the bus or the subway by myself, and I got out in the city. But I think that one of the key things was in college, I used to shelve books in the library to make a little extra money. And one day I was shelving books and I discovered the AIA guide, the first edition, the blue one. And that really changed me, because on vacations then I would use the AIA guide and really started discovering New York.
We discussed your childhood home in the previous oral history, but what never came up was actually your current home. And you talk about how preservation is about everyday buildings and everyday people, so I want to talk a bit about your everyday. So can you tell us about your current home neighborhood, please?
Well, I'm very lucky. I live in the most beautiful apartment complex in New York, which I can say because I've been on almost every block in New York. I live in this complex called Hudson View Gardens, which is this little Tudor village that overlooks the Hudson, and it has gardens, and I live down a private drive, and with beautiful gardens, and I come home at night and you inhale, and it's just incredibly beautiful. And I'm in the city, but it's so bucolic. In fact, I have a little house where I go to write in Columbia County, and I had to get used to traffic noise in the country because my apartment is so quiet. But it's in a really interesting neighborhood, a neighborhood that people don't. That a lot of people who don't live there don't really know. Historically, it's called Fort Washington, which is the name I still use for it. The real estate industry has renamed it Hudson Heights, a name I find really offensive. It's a neighborhood of apartment houses from the 1920s and 1930s. And the speculative apartment house of the early decades of the 20th century is a building type that preservationists and historians have skipped. You know, we're interested in row houses, we're interested in luxury apartments, and then we're interested in modernism. And this whole kind of traditional, especially the traditional looking ones, the deco ones people are interested in, but the colonial ones and the Tudor ones and the Mediterranean ones we've forgotten about. And so it's a really beautiful neighborhood, and I call it the last of the old New York neighborhoods because there are no chain stores, and the shopkeepers know who you are, and it's just a great place to live. And there is now just beginning a group that's going to be seeking historic district designation for the area.
We know that speculative housing development is one of your academic interests that you've researched quite extensively. Which came first, your decision to move into Washington Heights, a neighborhood with a lot of that housing type, or your decision to study speculative housing?
Well, the reason that I moved into Hudson View Gardens has to do with my working as a consultant. I was hired by the people that wanted Tudor City to be a landmark district. And I wrote a report on Tudor City. I did a lot of research on Tudor City. And the question that I always like to ask is, I always want to know why. And I wanted to know why the Tudor. And I got really interested in researching Tudor and all the social meanings of Tudor in the 1920s. And I found an article about Hudson View Gardens, and I believe I still do this. I Xerox every article or print out every article that I see that might be of interest in the future. And I had it, and then when we decided we were going to buy a co-op somewhere, I said, oh, I know this place looks really interesting. It was built in 1924, it's always been a co-op, and we went up, and the next day we bought an apartment. So, and so I was already interested in the kind of vernaculars of the 1920s architecture, and that sent me up there.
How would you say your academic experience as a student in Columbia's preservation program changed your perception of your home city?
One of the great things about Columbia when I was there was that there was a lot of freedom in deciding what you wanted to do. There were the required courses, but I was able to really focus on New York. And I started giving walking tours at that time, and I was able to do a thesis my thesis was on Protestant church architecture in Brooklyn. So I was able to and I was working at the Landmarks Commission as a student at that time too. So and we were working on a survey. So I spent time surveying in the Bronx, and this was the time when the Bronx was at its low point. It was to this day the most depressing thing I've ever done in my life was being part of that Bronx survey. But it did get me out to see the places in New York that I did not know. I knew Brooklyn really well, and I knew Manhattan, but I was learning about other places too, so that was really important.
So can you talk a bit more about how your interest in sacred places developed?
I got interested in sacred places because to me, they tell us something about who the people were at the time they were built, and then if you trace sacred spaces, you can see how neighborhoods change. So I see sacred places as the anchors of helping to understand neighborhood. And and I think really great examples. If you look at Harlem, look at Lenox Avenue, south of 125th Street, which is lined with these really grand religious institutions. There are like 4 churches and a synagogue, and they tell us something about the first generation of people that lived there. They're Protestant churches that were built in the 1880s and early 90s, and then a German Jewish synagogue comes in, and then to trace how they changed, how those congregations changed from Dutch Reformed Church to Seventh-day Adventist Church, tells us about what's happening in the neighborhood. And it's such a good way to understand neighborhood change and neighborhood evolution. And also, of course, they were what people invested money in. And so they are distinctive, unique buildings in any neighborhood, and I think that they reflect a lot about pride in the neighborhood. Up in the Mount Morris area in Harlem, there are beautiful row houses, but they were almost all built on speculation. So they reflect what developers thought people wanted, whereas the sacred spaces reflect what they actually wanted. And so I find them, they're very complex building type from which we can learn a lot.
What would you say are some highlights from your time of working for the Landmarks Preservation Commission?
When I worked at the Landmarks Commission, the staff had a lot of input, which is a lot less the case now. And we were doing surveys. We did a Bronx survey. We did a Brooklyn survey as well. And the staff could nominate buildings. And so I was able to get a lot of religious institutions and nominated. And I also was very interested in the suburbanization of Flatbush, which is something that I had worked on as a graduate school student. So I was able to persuade present to the commission Prospect Park South and Ditmas Park and get them interested in that. And as I was just telling Micah, one of my former students who is here, who lives in Clinton Hill, that I was so determined to get Clinton Hill designated as an historic district that when it happened, I said, okay, now I can leave the Landmarks Commission. Prospect Park South and Clinton Hill were the 2 things that I really wanted to see. But I just, sometimes I see something a building that I persuaded the Landmarks Commission to designate or to at least hold a public hearing on, and good things are happening. One of my absolute favorite buildings, a building that I bet very few of you know, is the Edge Hill Church of Spuyten Duyvil. It's this tiny little church in the southwest Bronx, in Spuyten Duyvil. It's this sort of arts and crafts Tudor building, very funky, designed by Francis Kimball, one of my favorite architects. And it had very small congregation when we did it. And then it was vacant for a while, and now it's the Spuyten Duyvil Historical Society has taken it over and is restoring it. So it's great to see that this building survives because it's a landmark, and that maybe I had a small bit in getting it designated. So it makes you feel good.
And clearly you've had a lot of great preservation successes. I do want to take a moment and talk about, are there examples from your time at the LPC or beyond of buildings or districts that were not designated that have really resonated with you throughout the years?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there are two projects that I worked on that we lost that I am very disappointed about. One is the Guggenheim Edition. To this day, I think it's the worst thing that's happened to architecture in New York in my life, that the Guggenheim Museum, which used to be this freestanding, dynamic, swirling building, now has an armature that holds it up. And it completely changes Wright's vision of what that museum should be. And every time I see it, I hate it. And I found there is one spot where you can stand on the west side of Fifth Avenue and not see it, where you can still see Wright's vision. And then and the other one is an obscure thing that I worked on, which was called the Cottages. The Cottages was this 2-story complex on 2nd Avenue or 3rd Avenue? On 3rd Avenue, that was built under the L. And it was built in the 30s, and on 3rd Avenue it had brick and glass block, and it didn't look like, it was nice, but it didn't look like a lot. But in the back, it was this incredible garden complex of housing, of small apartments that were stepped up on terraces and looked out on this garden, and it was so beautiful and so different from everything else in New York. And I believe it was heard, but rejected. It saddens me that's gone, because it was unusual. New York, a lot of New York is very predictable, and I don't mean that in a bad way, because I love the vernaculars of New York. I mean, that's what I spend most of my time researching. But sometimes you see something that's so different and so eccentric that it just makes you smile, and it's sad that it's gone.
Yeah, but I think it's important that we still talk about it, and that means that the story will be remembered. We at the Archive Project, I find, often talk about quote-unquote preservation failures in addition to successes. So it's important to hear that this still weighs on you even years later. So transitioning to the vernacular, I know you are a big advocate for cultural heritage and preserving the vernacular. Can you talk about how you have advocated for this type of heritage and why you think this is important to preserve?
So I don't think when I started in preservation, I don't think I really understood much about the vernacular or about cultural preservation. I was interested in like high-style churches and synagogues, but as I learned more and more, I really came to focus on the fact that what gives a place character are the everyday buildings that we walk by and maybe we don't even notice, but they're the building type of any place. And I think that I must have first noticed this when I got involved with the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. And I've been involved with them as a historian since the day after they discovered the building that they currently occupy at 97 Orchard Street. I was consulting at that time, and I got a call from one of the founders, explaining that they wanted to establish a tenement museum, and they needed somebody to write a history of this building that they had found, and would I come down and take a look at it? And so after I yawned, thinking, wow, that is not the most boring thing I can think of, I said okay, because when you're doing consulting, you don't say no. Unless they want you to advocate for demolishing the building or something like that. And so I went down, and the day I walked into the building that's now the Tenement Museum really changed my life. Just to be able to stand in this building that was in ruinous condition and get a feel for the lives that had been lived in this building. And my grandparents had lived on the Lower East Side, and it was so powerful to be there. And then I undertook the research, and then eventually did a book. And in fact, I've just finished a revised 3rd edition of the book, which will be out in a few months. It changed my focus and my understanding of the city. So since then, I've become interested in speculative apartment houses, apartment lofts, all these other kinds of vernacular buildings that are so defining of what New York is. And there are similar types of buildings everywhere that you go that give character. I love London, and London has its own vernaculars, and it's true of every place.
The Tenement Museum is one of my favorite museums in New York City. I grew up going there. I've been on your tour of the Tenement Museum. They are even one of our grantees for the Shelby White and Leon Levy Archival Assistance Grants. And oftentimes when I mention this museum, we manage to get back to Andrew Dolkart very quickly. Can you talk a bit more about your role in establishing this really important place in New York City today?
Well, yeah, I did all the initial research on the building, and I would say that the building is the Tenement Museum's most important artifact. And I think that for me, what's so important about the Tenement Museum is how unimportant the Tenement Museum's building is in a sense. It's an everyday tenement, and it was, and people, most importantly, my Columbia colleague Richard Plunz had written books about housing. And so the housing laws were known, so the big picture was known. But what I think is so important about the Tenement Museum is how it looks at the minutiae, at the little things, about the way people lived and how they lived and how the building evolved over time and how the laws impacted. The laws people knew about, but how did they impact on new buildings and how do they impact on forcing changes to be made on previously built buildings? And although all this study is of one building, I think it speaks for a whole building type and the hundreds of thousands of people who lived in these buildings. And I think that the fact that it's not just the four walls of the building, but it's the thousands of people that move through 97 Orchard Street over time that make it such a powerful thing. And I think one of the things that I argued for very strongly was that they should keep some of the ruined spaces, that they shouldn't restore every space or turn every space into a museum room. And I think that allows people to come and bring with them any stories that they might have. And I remember a colleague, Donna Gabaccia, who's a historian of Italian history, and who at the time was teaching in New York. And she said to me that that's great, but just remember that my grandparents didn't live like that. And I think that that's true, to have the balance that of seeing the ruin where the building has had lives, and then being able to go into the restored apartment that talks about an Italian family and the experience that they had. And I think that these things, and also the fact that they interpret the lives of real people, most of whom lived in the building, I think is why where so many house museums have declining visitation, the Tenement Museum has enormous visitation.
You're a historian, and I think equally importantly, you are someone who teaches the next generation of historians and preservationists how to research New York City. And your guide on how to research New York City is still something I consult on a regular basis. And you mentioned the thousands of stories of people who lived in the tenements. How would you recommend that people choose which stories are told in places like the Tenement Museum?
Just today I updated that research on New York. I think that a lot depends on what it is and what your ultimate goal is. I love the fact that the Tenement Museum interprets the lives of real people, that they're not making up stories from whole cloth. Now, of course, they're making up some aspects of the stories from research. And I think that that's important, to look for evidence of first of all, to understand the building. For me, the buildings have power. And so I think you have to understand the building. I think that's crucial. And the neighborhood that the building and the environment the building is located in. But then to tell real stories about the building. And this is why not only at the Tenement Museum, but what I think that the LGBT Historic Sites Project does successfully is that we look at extant buildings. Because for me and for I think most of us in this room and for people that are interested in preservation, buildings have power. And that I think it's crucial to get people to understand what that power is, that they might walk by a building every day and not realize why it's significant, that, oh, it's just a tenement, or it's just a row house, or it's just a garment loft, but what does it tell us about who we are, where we've been, where we're going, I think are things that are really, really important.
So I'm really thrilled that in this room are people who are professors in Columbia's program, as well as people who were students at the same time that I was at Columbia. And at least in my cohort, we played a game, went aside the project, of how long does it take to get to Andrew Dolkart when researching New York City building? And the answer was never more than 5 minutes, or 3 clicks on Wikipedia. It was really quite astounding how big of an impact you've had in your research and your writing. And I just want to know, what do you love about researching New York? Why do you continue to research New York so extensively?
Well, because there's always something to learn here. You can never exhaust the interests and the topics that are out there. I mean, every day I see a new building, or I see a building in a different light, or I'm researching and I find something completely new, even though I thought I knew it really well. And I think that's why. I mean, it's just, New York is just forever fascinating. And I have enough book ideas in my head for multiple lives.
So what's your current research fixation?
Well, no, for way too long I've been writing a book on the garment, on the architecture of the garment industry. And I've made a little progress this summer. It's all research, but I haven't gotten the chunk of time to write it. So I hope to get that done. Because that's a vernacular building type that, every New York, scratch any native New Yorker, and there's some ancestor had something to do with the garment trade, whether it was Jewish or Italian or Greek or Puerto Rican or black garment workers, or the old Knickerbocker families that ran the fabric trades. There's some story there. But I want to do something on speculative apartment houses of the 20s and the 30s. And so and I toyed with an idea of maybe not doing a book on speculative apartment houses, but doing a book on vernacular housing in the 20th century, and just having chapters on the different kinds of apartment houses and other building types. So that's what I'm kind of thinking about now.
So in our game of how long does it take to get to Andrew Dolkart, we would come up with countless National Register nominations. And I want to know, do you still feel that National Register listing and landmark designations are some of the best tools that we have in preserving the built environment?
Well, I do, in part because we haven't really come up with too many other successful tools. I do think landmarking is really important because it is a legal mechanism. And so once something is a landmark, you should be assured that it's going to be preserved. Now, of course, a lot depends on the strength or weakness of the Landmarks Commission. At the moment, I think the Landmarks Commission is not as strong as it has been in the past. But I do think that's important, but I don't think it's the only thing. And National Register nominations are great, sometimes just because it's really good PR and you can use it as a really strong argument for preservation, but also tax credits, because you're on the National Register, have saved a lot of buildings. Now there are a lot of National Register nominations being done for public housing in New York, and they're going for tax credits. Well, I think that's great. They don't all have to be landmarks. But I do wish that there were more things, and I do think that public recognition is really important so that people understand their environment. And so, that's what the LGBT Sites Project does. We have like almost 500 sites now, but they're not all landmarkable or National Register eligible. And I'm advising, and actually Emily is going to be a reader on a thesis that's being done now on sites of significance in the history of abortion, of the fight for abortion rights in New York. And most of these aren't landmarkable sites, but for the public to know that these everyday vernacular buildings have a rich history, I think is really important. So I think recognition is important, but I don't want to dismiss the idea of landmarking. I wish we were doing more of it.
What do you think recognition could look like beyond landmarking or National Register listing?
Well, I think websites are really great, and I personally do not do social media because my life is too short. I have trouble keeping up with email, but I do understand the value of it, and so I think that the internet, the web, allows for so much information to be out there to help us understand the city and to recognize places. And so I think that these are really positive developments.
Now, you talked about in our previous oral history your transition to becoming a professor, and your previous oral history with us was in 2019, so about 5 years have passed now. I want to know, how do you balance your life as a professor, an active scholar writing books, and as a practitioner still doing work in the field?
Well, it's hard. No matter how, there's sometimes, especially when in the fall semester I teach a studio, and that's very time consuming. But in the spring I don't, and I say, oh, this is going to be such an easy semester. I'll have lots of time to do other things, and then somehow all your time gets filled up with things at school. So you don't have as much time. But I do feel that, at least for me, it's really important to be involved in preservation. I don't think preservation is an ivory tower field. I don't think professors of preservation should only be doing academic work. I mean, preservation is a field where you have to be out there. And people are out there in different ways. People are activists in different ways, or historians in different ways. But for me, it's really important that I'm involved with organizations, and I try to find the time for it. And if you care enough about it, you'll find the time for it. That's why my Garment Center book isn't written, because there's other things that get in the way of that.
Remember, I helped you work on the garment book my first semester?
I remember, and students going back farther. I didn't think it would take so long, and I've forgotten the names of some of the students who helped me. So I'm going to be embarrassed when all the acknowledgments aren't as complete as they should be.
Research is endless. I think it's really interesting that you're one of, honestly, a few people in this room and plenty of people who went through the Columbia program as a student and is now a professor. How would you say the program has changed, or even preservation education has changed?
Well, I think it has changed a lot, but it still I think it still has the foundations. Some of the foundations that Jim Fitch established, the notion that preservation was not one thing, and that it wasn't only for architects. In Europe, most preservation education is for architects. That it was for planners and historians and architects and scientists. And I think that is still very much a part of preservation education in America. And the idea of educating students in all these different aspects so that they can maybe specialize in something, but they're familiar with it. But it has changed a lot. I think that there is in preservation education and preservation in general, a lot more interest in cultural issues, not just in bricks and mortar. And I think that that's a really significant change that's occurred in my lifetime. There is, of course, a lot more interest in issues of diversity, and this has been an issue that where preservation was lagged for I think for a while. But I think is catching up. And now, of course, there's a lot of interest in how preservation and climate overlap with one another. That's not a field of specialty for me, but it's a crucial issue for the future. Just yesterday in American architecture, we were talking about the first half of the 18th century, and I showed a neighborhood in Newport, the Point, which is probably the best concentration of 18th century vernacular houses from the early 18th century. And it's right at sea level. It's not going to be there in 30 or 40 years. What do we do with a neighborhood like that? How do we deal with that? So even from the historian's point of view, that the climate issues are really crucial. So those are, I think, how some ways we've changed and stayed the same.
So a question that I have, and a question that also a couple people submitted is, what's some advice you have for people who are interested in getting involved with preservation?
Well, it's getting involved. I mean, I think you can't be involved. You can't do preservation by just sitting in your house. You have to get involved. You have to get involved with preservation groups, neighborhood groups. If there isn't one, help establish one. You know, just like somebody called me up a few months ago and said, I'm really interested in an historic district in Fort Washington. Were you interested in getting involved with a community group? And so I said, yes, so did Emily. She's on this committee too. And so I think that that's the most important thing, is to get involved. And you can get involved in lots of different ways. You can get involved quietly behind the scenes. You can get involved by being a loud New York activist. You know, all good. But I think that for people, preservation is a community activity, and that's really important. And even if you're a research hermit, like I tend to be sometimes, you're doing it because you're involved, and because what you're finding and producing is being used for for advocating for preservation.
We could talk for hours, but I do want to leave time for something very rare in the oral history world, which is a live Q&A session. So I am going to hand the mic over to Tony Wood, founder of the Archive Project.
Andrew, to kind of the current generation of young preservationists, you're probably best known for your advocacy on LGBT studies. But for decades, you've been the go-to person for any effort, any advocacy effort, providing the intellectual capital, whether it was city and suburban, Rizzoli building, the Lalique windows, all of those great things. So you've ended up working very closely with some of those advocates, those passionate people. And I'm just curious, any kind of insights you've had, what were your favorite? Is there a favorite advocacy battle that you were involved with? And was there one of those wonderful, wild, crazy, preservation, maniacally focused advocates who kind of has left a pleasant memory with you?
Well, I think actually, it was, because I'm a native New Yorker, I can work with all these crazy New Yorkers. You know, I worked with Arlene Simon and Betty Wallerstein and all these great neighborhood people. You know, sometimes they can drive you crazy, but ultimately they're doing great stuff, and so that's good. But you know, you asked also, you know, what something that really, I don't remember the wording, that made me really proud of what I did. Well, the Lalique windows are the best thing. I don't know if everybody may not know this. On Fifth Avenue, between 54th and 55th, on the west side of the street, where Rizzoli bookstore was once, and on the same block with the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, there was a completely rundown, going out of business, rip-off the tourist building, and it had been purchased by a developer, and the MAS was interested in trying to save Fifth Avenue, and they asked me to research whatever I wanted on Fifth Avenue. And I had always noticed by looking up, because I always look up, that there was these incredibly dirty, grungy windows that looked really interesting. They were three-dimensional, and one floor was occupied. I went in, and they were fantastic from the inside. And I started researching them, and they turned out to be the only Lalique storefront in America. We got leaked to the press, and lo and behold, Landmarks, which had said they were not going to hold a public hearing on these buildings, changed their mind, and they were designated. And for a long time, it was the front facade of Bendel's. Now it's for rent. And every time I see those, it makes me smile. That, you know, they're there because something I discovered, and it makes you feel good.
And Andrew also talks about those extensively in our previous oral history too, with the same level of joy and pride as well. So it's really great to see that that's carried through.
Okay, as a former Wall Street guy, I'm sorry I have to ask this, but you used the term, I believe, speculative housing. I'm guessing that, could you define that for me? Because I think it's probably different than what I define as speculative housing.
Well, most of New York is built up by what I would call speculative housing, which was put up by speculative builders, who I think were no different from speculative builders today. They invested money in building to make a profit. And they built, but speculative housing didn't mean cheap housing. It meant that you were building housing for what the market would bear. And if you were building middle-class row houses in Clinton Hill or Bedford-Stuyvesant, well, if you built in the mid-19th century, you built with a brownstone front and a high stoop because that's what was going to sell. And if you were a speculative builder of apartment buildings for the lower middle class, you built 5- and 6-story buildings with modest apartments, but with amenities in them, and that would rent to people. So but it was always profit-making housing, or other kinds of buildings. And I think that, and New York is made up. Over 90% of New York is speculative buildings. If they're speculative office buildings, speculative housing, speculative garment lofts, and so that's what I mean. And I think, you know, speculative builders may be financed in a way that's very different today, but ultimately they're building to make a profit. I think that it's similar. And if you had asked the speculative builder who put up the brownstone row houses on South Portland Avenue in Fort Greene, whether he thought that 150 years after they were built, they would be beloved in an historic district, he would have laughed at you, because that was not his intention. He was intending to build buildings that could sell at a profit for, in that case, an upper middle class market. And I think that's what speculative builders always do. And I think we should appreciate that we are a city of speculative building and not denigrate the idea of speculative building.
I've got a question in that vein, actually. Oftentimes the enemy of preservation is the new speculative building. So how do we judge, like, when to choose the moment of preservation? That this is what's to be preserved, not what came before it, and not what's going to come after it.
Well, I don't think in the broad brush that the speculative building is the enemy of preservation. It just depends where it is. I'm not opposed to new construction. There are lots of places where new construction is great, but I think that we need to consider more as we're doing rezoning or as we're doing other proposals to change, to look at what is valuable that is there and try to preserve that. Because I think that one thing that we have learned, this was a mantra when I got involved and with Carol Clark here, who was in my class at Columbia, was that the new and the old mix well together, and that makes for a dynamic city. And I think that the most dynamic neighborhoods have that mix of the new and old. And so I'm not opposed to tall buildings. I'm not in favor of tall buildings everywhere. And I'm not opposed to new construction. I think that makes a dynamic city. I love the fact that I can go away for 2 months and come back and my neighborhood has changed. Because that's why we live in a dynamic city, and that's why we want to live in New York. And I go to too many cities that we're not Toledo, Ohio, where I'm on a campaign to visit all the art museums of America, and I did all the industrial towns of Ohio a couple of summers ago. And Toledo was the most depressing place I've ever been. And we're not Toledo, and that's great. I'm not for Toledo, but but we're dynamic and we're changing, and people want to invest money here and build, and to have the new and the old together is what makes New York an exciting place.
Andrew, thank you. Emily, thank you. So as we look to cement future victories, what do some of the successful preservation campaigns over time have in common?
That was one that would probably need a little bit more thought, but I would say that it was neighborhood support, that this idea of a community fighting for something vocally is what has been successful. And I think that's really important. I mean, sometimes one person can send in a letter to the Landmarks Commission and say, oh, you should designate this, and they will. But that doesn't happen very often anymore. That used to happen, that anybody could just send in a request or a letter, and Landmarks might act on it. But I think that a community working together, and not only the members of the citizens of the community, but working with their political officials, I think that that's really, really crucial. And this is a place where I think that the preservation community has not been successful, especially with the city council changing over, members changing over regularly. We haven't been out there meeting with them all and getting them interested in preservation. When I know the Landmarks Conservancy used to do that, but not so much anymore. And I think that is, and there are people, there are preservationists who are really great at that, at going and sitting down with politicians and talking with them, and that we need to get that support, as well as the people of the community to do it, because otherwise, why is anybody going to listen to us?
I just want to thank you for remembering the cottages, which was like a real loss, I think. So if one is interested in housing, and I hate this term housing because it projects such a institutional sort of thing. What was interesting about the cottages was that it was a really inventive housing form. It was commercial on the avenue, and it was this Georgian revival paradise on the back. And I think it would be interesting, since you're interested, this is not going to be a question. Since you are interested in housing, I think it would be interesting for preservationists to try and make a catalog of the large quantity of really inventive housing forms we have in New York City. I'm thinking, for example, about the Charlotte Bronte houses, which are uptown, which are an apartment building that masquerades as a big house. So I think there are a lot of very inventive housing solutions in New York City, which I think have gone unrecognized. And I think it would be interesting for the preservation movement to be interested in this in the context of our attempt to create more housing, because I think we tend to just think of a certain model, and I think that preservationists have something to offer to this problem.
Well, I think that you're right, that there's a lot of really interesting and creative housing, the amalgamated housing both on the Lower East Side and in the Bronx. Neither one of them has been the subject of much preservation interest, and there are a lot of what I call low-income co-ops. These labor co-ops that were very much involved with socialist politics that have not been looked at. But I also think, and I know that you're particularly interested in this, Francois, is low-income housing projects and Tower in the Park projects. It's time for us to reevaluate some of the things that many people of my generation got involved in preservation to stop are now maybe more interesting. Last year we did our studio last fall, focused on mostly on post-war office buildings in Midtown, and buildings that I've always really disliked. Turned out to be fascinating, and it's time to I had not really reevaluated them since the time when they were relatively new, and now it's the time for us to start doing that. And I think that there's, not only in housing, but in many other kinds of buildings, there's a lot that's interesting out there that we don't know, we haven't recognized as well as we should.
Very personal question. Andrew Dolkart is doing research on worker housing in the mid-19th century, and he comes across a book that has vernacular bank buildings in Staten Island. What keeps you from going down the rabbit hole?
Well, that's a problem. We all love going down the rabbit hole. I do go down the rabbit hole frequently. And that's why I try to
How do you stop it?
I try to just save all these things so that so that in case I need to write something about banks in Staten Island, I've got some of that information handy. But it's hard, and I have to say, and I'm sure I'm not the only person that impacted on this. I wrote, my first major book was Morningside Heights, A History of Its Architecture and Development. And I basically wrote that over 2 summers because I just sat there with all my Xeroxes and I wrote. And there was no internet, there was nothing to get in my way. And now, you know, you sit down to write and you write one sentence and then you're looking stuff up on the internet and like 4 hours later, you haven't written another word. And sometimes I think, you know, maybe it would be good to shut myself off in a cabin somewhere with a 60-watt bulb, and that's it.
Thank you all for joining us for this live oral history with Andrew Dolkart. Thanks again to the J.M. Kaplan Fund for hosting us here tonight, and to Coco Nelson, our brand new administrative coordinator, who's been really instrumental in getting this together. And as with all of our oral histories, this will be transcribed and uploaded onto our website.
It's like a family of history.